Okay. Good morning, everyone. Yeah, Yvonne, this one here. Okay. Okay, good morning, everyone. It's week 2 of our series, Changing Habits, the topic of this time of the year. So just to start off with a little bit of a review, essentially we talked about the basis of the theory of changing habits in the book Atomic Habits by James Clear, is the idea of small steps equals small wins, and that's how you build up the process of acquiring new and healthy habits. We discussed the importance of the journey, not just the outcome. Especially in Judaism, we know that sometimes effort is even more important than the outcome. We have this concept. We didn't say this last week, but I've shared it before. That we say every day in the Shema, we should love God with all your heart, with all your soul, and all your me'odecha. Me'odecha is a yeah. Well, that's one way of translating it. But actually, the word me'odecha comes from the word me'od, which means very, which isn't normally conjugated that way, but it says like your very. What does your very mean? Because that's the idea. It emphasizes the journey. The idea is just to keep growing and to do a little bit more than you normally do. In other words, your very. Everyone's very is different. Like very much, but everyone's very is a little bit different. And he discussed this idea of the compounding effect of small changes. In other words, when you have small changes, even though you don't notice them, we can make little changes to our life. They seem not obvious, but then after a while, suddenly they show up as tremendous change. Then we discussed the whole idea of goals, and he suggested that systems are more important than goals. Of course, we have to have goals, but when we focus too much on our goals, it's detrimental. However, we did include a discussion on values, and we need values, and values we do need goals. We need an overall goal. The mission statement idea that we spoke about from Stephen Covey, to know that we have the ladder, we're climbing the ladder on the right building, and those values, of course, inform and guide our habit changing, because what habits do we need to change? How do we need to live our life? So that overall value system and goals, life goals, are important, and then they inform of how we should go about changing one little bit at a time the habits that we have. Okay. Before we start today's discussion, I want to just remind everyone, and you can pick up the flyer when you're finished. I gave it out last week, but in case you didn't get all the information. First of all, this coming Monday night at Shelley's home, we have a discussion, a really important discussion, pre-Rosh Hashanah, pre-going into the new year, of the lessons that we can learn going into the new year, especially this year. For those that want, the second day, Rosh Hashanah, the Friday, the service in Vaucluse, and then just to get into your diary, the Sukkot events. I put you also on this flyer. We have a Sukkot event for men as well, so people can tell their husbands, their friends, their brothers, their cousins. Sukkot Men's Club on the Monday night of the 21st, but then the morning, that morning is our yearly Women's Sukkot morning tea. That's Monday morning the 21st. And then just because you guys don't eat a lot anyway, we'll just give the leftovers to the men that night. And they'll finish it off. But do eat, actually, because that's really a mitzvah. It's a mitzvah to eat in the sukkah. But I haven't yet convinced you properly, so we'll get there one day. All right. Okay. So today, I'm going to base myself on chapter 2. By divine providence, nothing happens by chance, as we know. But he discusses an important foundation in habit changing, which is really, really important. Next week, which is the last one, we're going to summarize the 4 steps in the book that he talks about, actually practically how we change habits. But he raises a very important point. Well, I say it's divine providence because I'm sure he wrote it to be discussed just before Rosh Hashanah, because it's really important at this time of the year. But let's first go through what he says, and then we'll discuss its relevance coming into a new year, coming into Rosh Hashanah, and so on. So he starts off the chapter by saying, why is it so easy to repeat bad habits and so hard to form good habits? And he talks about that, sometimes we do them for a couple of days, then we give them up, and so on. But he says, we do know, and particularly with bad habits, this happens a lot, that once habits become established, they seem to stick around forever, right? Especially the unwanted ones. So he says the following. He says, changing our habits is challenging for two reasons. First of all, we try to change the wrong thing. And then he says number two, we try to change our habits in the wrong way. Okay, so the wrong way we're going to do, next week we'll talk about the right way. But we're going to talk about what does it mean to change the wrong thing today, right? So he says the following, and it's on the handouts just to make it clear that I copied his diagrams because they're really good. He says in changing a habit there are really three things, right? And think of them like in concentric circles or circles of an onion, right? There's the outcomes, in other words, what is the outcome they want to change? What do they want to do differently? There's the process of how we get there. And then there's the identity of who we actually are, right? In other words, what kind of person are we that wants us or that's pushing us to change the habit? Or what kind of person do we want to be, right? He says what happens is like this. If you look at those two diagrams on the right, very often people change habits in an outcome-based way. In other words, they first change the outcome, and then they first focus what I want to do differently, and then we talk about the process, and then they worry about the kind of person they are, which has got to do, as we talked about last week, got to do with our values and the type of person we want to be, and so on. But and that's the deepest layer, the layer of identity. But he says, identity is what you believe, right? So he says exactly this. Many people begin the process of changing habits by focusing on what they want to achieve. This leads us to outcome-based habits. The alternative, and this is the point of this chapter, is to build identity-based habits. In other words, with this approach, if you see that lower diagram, we start, right, by focusing on who we wish to become. Who are we? So he gives an example. Thanks. He gives an example. He says, imagine two people trying to resist a cigarette. It's not such a good example nowadays because nowadays, thank God, society has moved away, at least in here anyways, from smoking, but it's slapped. Let's say it says, imagine two people resisting a cigarette, right? So the first person says, no thanks, I'm trying to quit, right? In other words, the person still believes they're a smoker. So I'm a smoker, I'm just trying a different way. I'm trying to quit, right? The second person says, no, I don't smoke. I'm not a smoker. That's a very, very subtle difference, right? But it's a shift in the way we think about ourselves. It might be a silly example when it comes to smoking, but it's a very profound idea. We can develop it a bit more soon, but it really is a beautiful concept. In other words, how do I see myself as a smoker that's trying to quit, or a non-smoker that's just trying to be a non-smoker, or working on being a non-smoker, right? She says most people don't even consider identity change when they set out to improve, right? They never shift the way they look at themselves, and they don't realize that their old identity can sabotage the new plans for change. Okay? And he goes on to explain the following. He says, behind every system of actions, there's a system of beliefs. Behavior that is incongruent with the self will not last. He says, his example, you may want more money, but if your identity is someone who consumes rather than creates, you'll continue to be pulled towards spending rather than earning, right? And he gives a bunch of other examples. In other words, even simple practical things of what we want to try and do, everything we want to try and do has to do and is connected with the type of person we want to be. And when we never shift who we want to be, we just focus on the outcome, who we want to be remains the old person, and therefore sabotages the process of creating a new habit. It's put very, very nicely, I have to say. Right? Improvements are only temporary until they become part of who you are. And he gives a couple of good lines. He says, the goal is not to read a book. The goal is to become a reader. The goal is not to run a marathon, but the goal is to become a runner. And the goal is not to learn an instrument. The goal is to become a musician. Right? Now, obviously, it doesn't contradict what he said last week. In other words, once you decide on your identity, it doesn't mean you can become that right away. Then starts the process of changing habits where you have to do it with small wins and small steps one at a time. That remains true. But those small steps and that one at a time will be more successful if they're based on an identity that you want to become, on a belief system that you have, right? And he says it's a double-edged sword, right? Because when working for you, identity change can be a powerful force of self-improvement. But when working against you, identity change can be a curse, right? Because once you've adopted an identity, you can easily let your allegiance to it impact your ability to change. Like people say things like, well, I say this, I'm terrible with directions, right? That's an identity. I'm not a morning person, people say, right? I'm bad at remembering people's names. I'm always late. I'm not good at technology. I'm horrible at math, right? People say that. They make these statements, which are not statements of what they could or can't do, it's statements of who they are. It's an identity. Once you form that kind of identity, it becomes almost impossible to change. Now, it's a very, very beautiful idea and a very foundational idea. Before I go on, of course, it doesn't mean that it's never okay to keep that identity. Just don't expect to be successful, right, at changing the habits. Like, not every habit needs to be changed. So I'll give you an example. I want to defend myself here. So I always do say that I have no sense of direction, which happens to be true, by the way, right? Which, by the way, is very problematic for me. I'll give you an example. I don't know if I've told you this before, right? Because my kids all laugh at me. So when I go to Westfield, which isn't often, but when I do, there's only one area I can park, because it's the only area I know. It's on the first level, we're near the Coles. You know the Coles when you go in? And I will circle for 10 minutes to find a parking space there, not even go to the floor below. Because I know once I go to the floor below, I'm going to lose myself and I won't find my car. Right? I've worked out which the good times there to go, what are the most likely parking spots there in the corner. And yeah, I've studied that area really, really well, right? But the truth is that actually I'm not working on it. I'm not working on it because I've got a lot of imperfections. I've got a lot of things I need to improve on. And I've got a lot of things I'm working on. Which, those things I'm working on, I need to change their identity. That's true. That doesn't have to be one of them. I'll survive by parking in the Coles area for the near future. One day when I decide this is the thing I'm going to work on, then I'll have to work on the identity, which is correct. But for now, it's fine. So I just want to say, it's okay. It doesn't mean everything you have to always change. But if you have an identity and you're comfortable with retaining that identity for now, that's fine. But if you're not comfortable with it, then don't think you can retain the identity and change the habit, because that's not going to work. That's the point. Now, I want to put this all into different types of habit changing, right? He's talking about, learning an instrument or reading a book or things like that. But let's go back to the discussion we had last week about values. Because when we get into habits that are connected and guided by values, right? Or we talk about, our growth, our emotional growth, our personal growth, our spiritual growth, that is connected specifically with purpose, not just things you want to do, but actually connected with purpose and linked to the values that we have in life, then this idea that he says that you need to start with identity and belief in who you are in order to form those habits becomes even more crucial. And not only becomes even more crucial, but as I said before, it's directly connected to this time of the year. And in fact, this is the story, this idea, especially in value growth, especially in growth that is connected with our values, our spiritual values, our emotional values, our purpose values, right? This is the story, this point that he made, this is the story of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. Now, I've shared this idea with you before, but I'm going to share it again because it's so relevant to this time of the year. So it's a big theme of this time of the year, of course, as we talked about last year and other years, is the idea of tshuva, right? Tshuva means reconnecting, returning, repenting. All those things are part of tshuva. The word tshuva actually means to return and to reconnect to God, reconnect to our soul, our purity of our soul. And this is the theme of this time of the year, and the whole idea of tshuva is that it should result in some form of change, right? Not just about saying I'm sorry, it's not just about getting forgiveness, it's about actually making a move towards becoming a better person on all levels. So in order to exercise the idea of tshuva, God gave us a gift. It's the gift of these 2 months, right? The gift of these 2 months, the month of Elul and the month of Tishrei. In fact, I just saw recently an amazing thing, that the relationship between God and us is a relationship like a marriage. So God gave us the Torah was like a relationship, a marriage, right? And God used the expression when he told Moses to go and tell the Jewish people that they would enter into a relationship with him and they would stand at Mount Sinai and they would become his people and so on. He used the word V'yitem li, they will become to me, right? A few times I found this word li in that relationship between us and God, like similar to what a groom says to a bride under the chuppah when there's a marriage. He says, "Re'at, you are betrothed li, mekudeshet li," and God used a very similar phrase li a few times in the preparation to Matan Torah. And what's fascinating is that there's a Kabbalistic book called Sefer Yetzirah. Sefer Yetzirah is, just a tangent if you don't mind, a bit of a Kabbalah thrown in here. So there's a book called Sefer Yetzirah, which is the book of creation, examining the tools with which God created the world. And we know that one of the foundations of creation, the godly foundations of creation, are the 22 letters of the alphabet, and they have all sorts of categories. Like there's the syllable letters, there's all different types of letters, and then there's a group of 12 letters. And those 12 letters, each month is connected to one of those letters, right? Now, one of the reasons that God said the word li, the Kabbalah explains, is that lamed, the lamed in the li, is the highest letter, right? Yud, li is lamed yud. Yud is the smallest letter. And what God was saying is that this infinite God is connecting to, and wants a relationship with the greatest letter. In other words, God himself, the infinite God, is connecting to and marrying and having a relationship with the smallest of beings, which is the human being, which is the Yud. So we're infinitely lower than God, and yet he entered into a relationship with us, right? And formed a relationship with us when he gave us the Torah, and he made us a nation. Interestingly enough, however, in Sefer Yetzirah it says that Elul is the letter of Yud, and Tishrei, which is the next month, the month of the festivals, is the letter of Lamed. So when God said that I want the nation to become a nation li to me, he was saying, actually, when that relationship is really going to be emphasized? When that relationship can be repaired if there's a weakness in the relationship? When it can be deepened? Elul and Tishrei, the month of Elul and Tishrei. So the word li is specific, symbolizes the relationship between the Lamed and the Yud, God and us. And when is that emphasized and fixed and deepened and returned to and reconnected to? These 2 months, the month of Elul and Tishrei. So what's the process of the month of Elul and Tishrei? So we know that this month is the month of Cheshbon. It's the month when we look back at the year gone by. It's not looking back. Confronting the year gone by sounds scary, sounds confronting, but it's not. It actually needs to be seen in the context of opportunity and a gift that God gives us to look at the past and be able to fix it and repair it and learn from it, right? Because we know that Elul, we've said this many times, the time where we are taught that God is like the king in the field, is accessible, he's close. It's a month of tremendous closeness. It's a time when the king comes to the field, we are taught, and Mareh Parnim Sochakot, he smiles anyway. This is the month, right? And of course, when we look at the year gone by and we're honest, we identify weaknesses, we identify failures and successes, and we try to make amends. We apologize to God, which is okay, He knows that we fail. We ask Him, we're asking for forgiveness, we make a plan to do a little bit better in the coming year, and then it's a new year and we start a fresh new year in our relationship between us and God. Okay. So the famous question that is always asked, which goes to the heart of what we're talking about today, is how does Rosh Hashanah fall into this picture? In other words, we have Elul. So Elul, we know, we examining ourselves, we're thinking about it, we're reflecting, we're exploring, we're identifying stuff that's good, that's been successful, we're identifying stuff that needs to be fixed, that needs to be improved on, and we're going to make a plan to form a new habit. Comes Yom Kippur, God forgives us completely, gives us a clean slate. He asks us to make a little bit of a plan. Yom Kippur, when we walk into shul, there's that long list of things that we say we might have done. We confess, we specify, we go into detail, and hopefully we come out of Yom Kippur with a bit of a plan for the coming year to do a bit better, right? But where does Rosh Hashanah come into the picture? Rosh Hashanah almost looks like an interruption between Elul and Yom Kippur. Why is it there? Of course, it's just the new year. As the commentaries are, surely it would make more sense to have Elul, then have Yom Kippur, get it all out of the way, clean slate, and then start the new year. Kind of, Yom Kippur should be the day before Rosh Hashanah. Imagine that, right? Yom Kippur, we're clean, we're forgiven, we made a plan for the new year, we're ready for the new year, let's eat apple and honey, and Brother Shafar, it all be good, right? New year. But it's not like that. Why? It's not like that because Rosh Hashanah, although we don't talk about any specific plans on Rosh Hashanah, or any specific transgressions or weaknesses, but actually it's part of the process. It's part of the journey of tshuva. Why? Because when we come out of Elul, this is the essence of Rosh Hashanah. When we come out of Elul, and we want to make amends, and we want to apologize, and we want to not only apologize, we want to change. We want to actually take upon ourselves something new for the coming year. As he says in the book, the first thing we need to do is to create a belief in who we are. Right? Now the difference between Rosh Hashanah and what he says in the book is this. He says that we have to create a belief system. We have to create a belief in who we want to be. Rosh Hashanah is deeper than that. Not only do we create a belief of who we want to be, we actually reveal who we really are. You get that? It's a very big difference. So yes, changing a habit requires a belief system first. You have to really form an identity, not just say, I'm going to do this, I'm going to get angry less, and I'm going to do this mitzvah, and I'm going to be nicer to this person. That's outcome habit changing. That only really lasts if you have an identity first. But sometimes with just normal worldly things, it means creating an identity. Rosh Hashanah, that's exactly what Rosh Hashanah is, just a little bit different. Rosh Hashanah is about revealing our identity. We are all actually, that's our real identity. Every one of us has a soul, every one of us has an identity that we want to do better. That's who we are. We want to be more spiritual. We want to have purpose. We want to be nicer to other people. That's who we are. That's our true identity, which is covered up a lot of times by the things we do wrong. But that's who we really are, and that's what Rosh Hashanah is. Rosh Hashanah is before we get into the Elul. Before we get into the Yom Kippur. Elul means that we've confronted the past. We understand what we need to do. That's what Elul is. We now have come to the conclusion. We know what we need to do. We know the plan we need to make. But we have to first address the identity, so we have Rosh Hashanah first to reveal who we in essence really are. And that goes to the famous analogy that the Baal Shem Tov said about the shofar. You know, the mitzvah, the key mitzvah of Rosh Hashanah is hearing the shofar. Not apple and honey, by the way. It's very important, apple and honey. Right? I know that Rosh Hashanah meals are really important. And they are. When one gets together, family connects, beautiful. But it's not as important as hearing the shofar. You know me, I'll use any opportunity to throw that in, right? So, but I'm going to explain why the shofar is so important. Okay. By the way, people know me already. I'm a very excited person about the Jewish calendar in general. In fact, I decided to write an article about it this week. So check out my article tomorrow when you get the email. It's about why the Jewish calendar is so important. The music of the Jewish calendar. But it really is important, and that's how we connect to our Jewishness. The calendar is really the tapestry of Jewish experience. Anyway, so in Rosh Hashanah we have the mitzvah of blowing the shofar, or I should say hearing the shofar. So the Baal Shem Tov says, what is that? What's the reason? There are many reasons given why we blow the shofar. What's the reason? It's a mitzvah from the Torah, but what's the reason behind it, right? People say it's a wake-up call. It is. The Baal Shem Tov gave a very deep idea, and he said the following. I'm sure I've said it somewhere along the line, but I'll just repeat it again. That he said, as all good ancient Jewish parables go, it starts with a king. And there was a king who had a son, a prince, and the prince grew up in the palace and was pampered and protected by the cocoon, sort of the protected cocoon of the palace experience. And one day the king decided that to make his son a better person, a better human being, he needs to expose him to the experiences, the challenges, and the ups and downs of the wider world. So he gives him a lot of resources, a lot of money, and he sends him into the world and says, go make something of yourself. And he goes, and the prince wanders, and he gets into bad company, and he assimilates with people that he meets, and drifts further and further away from the palace. And then he forgets even that he's a prince, he forgets even how to talk like a prince, forgets the language of his father's area, and he's a complete mess. One day, he had a moment of clarity, and he thinks to himself, what did I do? Like, I've drifted so far. I need to come back. So he decides he's going to come back, and he decides to return to the palace. And he comes to the palace, and he knows that he's supposed to, he remembers his father vaguely. And he comes to the palace, and of course a palace has a lot of security and guards and so on, and he doesn't know how to talk to them. He can't communicate to them. He's forgotten the language. So he gestures that he's like the son, he tries to say. He doesn't look like a prince, he doesn't speak like a prince. So they think he's just some Meshuggah. So he doesn't know what to do. So after a while, out of desperation, he just starts to cry. And as he starts to cry, the story goes that the king, his father, sitting in the throne room, hears the cry. And he recognizes the cry. He recognizes it's his son. It's his son. And he runs out of the palace, and he embraces him, and he brings him in, and they rebuild the relationship, and he repairs and he rebuilds. Said the Baal Shem Tov, the shofar is the same thing. We are the prince, and God sent us into this world to improve, to become stronger, but the world is a dangerous place. But it was by design. And that's why he knows we fail sometimes, and sometimes we do it well, sometimes we don't do it well. But then sometimes there's a once a year where it's Rosh Hashanah, it's a new year, we want to come back, we want to return. But sometimes we've forgotten who we really are. We don't speak the way we really are. We don't communicate that way. We don't dress the way we really are. We don't express ourselves consciously and behaviorally and emotionally of who we really, fitting into who we really are. But then comes the shofar, and the shofar is such a deep time, such a deep experience, right? That we blow that simple cry. Because that simple cry comes from the depth of the neshama, the depth of the soul. It comes from such a deep place that it expresses an identity that cannot even be expressed in words. And it doesn't need to be expressed into words. And when we blow the shofar, what we're really saying is, my habits, my behavior, my emotional structure, my social structure is a bit all over the place and maybe not inconsistent with being a prince, but the cry is. My true identity is that I'm still a prince. I'm still your son, and you are still my father. That's the shofar. That's the simple tkiyah, the broken sounds of the shofar, the smooth sound of the shofar. It's that cry that doesn't say anything, but it doesn't say anything, it doesn't do anything, but it expresses the deepest identity of who we really are. And that's what Rosh Hashanah is all about. That's the essence of Rosh Hashanah. Because when we want to change, when we want to improve emotionally, socially, spiritually, whatever step, small step, big step that we want to take in the coming year, the first thing we need to do is we need to remind ourselves, so to speak, and God, so to speak, of who we really are. When we understand that we are really a prince, then we can change those habits. That was the point in this book. But again, the depth of the shofar is a bit different to how he explains it in the book, because he says you have to create a belief to create an identity. We don't have to create a belief. We have that belief deep down. It's just covered up. It's not always exposed. We're not always conscious of it. When we blow the shofar, we reveal it. It's not creating it, it's revealing it. Because that's who we really are, right? Because if we don't do this, then Yom Kippur is meaningless. Why? Because if I have an identity and I don't believe I'm a prince, in other words, if I say I'm an angry person, right? I'm an angry person, but I should work on it. If you believe you're an angry person, that's your identity, you're not going to change. You can try, it'll be successful for a couple of days, but you don't, it's like this, I'm a smoker, but I'm going to try not to smoke. But my identity is I'm a smoker, right? So if my identity is I'm an angry person, then I'm going to remain an angry person. Or someone says, I'm just not a kind person, right? We lock ourselves in. We lock ourselves in. Or my favorite example is, because this often happens with me when I meet new people, and I introduce myself, or they introduce themselves to me. I don't know why people feel the need to say this to me. They say, hi Rabbi, yes, it's a pleased to meet you, but I'm not a very good Jew. I'm not a religious person. Like, I guess I look religious, I suppose, so they always say, right? Or some people even say, I'm not a good Jew. I don't know what that means even, right? First of all, I'm not a priest. I wasn't looking for confession. I was just looking to get to know the guy. Like, second of all, I don't know what a good Jew and a bad Jew is. Every Jew's got a soul. That's what I normally say. I say, you got a soul? You got a Jewish soul? So do I. Like, you know. So if a good Jew means having a soul, then I'm a good Jew. You're a good Jew. We're all right. But I mean this very seriously. I don't know. It's not just a thing that I say. I actually do that. I don't know what that means. Yeah, I mean, I guess people say I'm not observant or less observant, more observant. But that doesn't mean we're all on a journey, right? We're all on a journey. No one's perfect. I'm not the first one not to be perfect. Collect mitzvahs. Oh, very good. I like that. In other words, some people grew up a particular way, and who knows in the eyes of God what's better. Some people might not observe everything, but they take upon themselves in the new year a mitzvah that's difficult for them. They might be better than a person like me who's been doing the things for many years, because that's where I grew up and that's what I was exposed to. Do I really work hard? Do I work as hard as the other person did? So I don't know. In other words, if religious means a Jew, then we're all religious. I don't know, but I don't like the word religious. But if we're a Jew, that's it. That's our identity. We're connected to God. We're connected to God, and we all need to and believe that we should. Deep down, we all believe that we should grow in that journey. We should become a better person. We should become more connected to God, especially, as I've been saying the last few weeks, especially this year. We see this happening this year. Look what's happened. Now, in the last, since October, if you need a proof that Jews have a soul, a special soul, we don't need a better proof in this past year. With all its tragedies, the soul's exploded. The Jewish soul's absolutely exploded. Some people are still resisting it, but it really has exploded. You see it coming forth. You see where people talk. You see where people express their Judaism. You see how people, I said this last week, I just saw a video, such a beautiful video. I saw a video last week of a group of soldiers in Gaza, and they were preparing the food for Shabbat. And I could see some of them would call themselves religious, some of them would call themselves not so religious. You can see some wearing yarmulke, some weren't wearing yarmulke. Right? By the way, I'll tell you a beautiful little story before I get back to this video. There was a Jew in Jerusalem before the war, a very famous Jew called Rabbi Levine. Rabbi Levine was a big rabbi, and he was the most beautiful, beautiful person, known as he used to go to the prisons, and the British had chucked the prisoners into jail to go visit them and talk to them, every person, but he just loved every person. He never labeled any person, never judged any person, but he just was very, very amazing. And one time he came out, he wanted to discuss something with the guy. He was a very short man, and he came out to a big bulvan. He was like a big guy, and he wanted to talk to him. I don't know about teach him Torah. I don't know what he wanted to do. And the guy says to him, "Rabbi, you talking to me? You see, I don't even wear yarmulke." So he was a very short guy. He says, I'm a very short person. I can't see your head. I'm talking to your heart. Which is very beautiful, right? So this video I saw, like there were obviously different types of people there. Some wearing tzitzit, some weren't wearing tzitzit, all soldiers. They were praying for Shabbat, and they all got involved. They were singing Al-Chadadi, and they were singing songs while they were preparing. just the neshama is burning, right? The neshama is burning because that's who we really are. But sometimes we just don't tap into that. We just don't tap into that identity. So Rosh Hashanah is a time when we unlock ourselves. And we need a Rosh Hashanah. To get to a Yom Kippur, we need a Rosh Hashanah. Because what Rosh Hashanah stands for is, we don't talk about specifics. We don't talk about any details in Rosh Hashanah. Even though we've just finished an Elul, and the next logical thing is, in this tshuva formula, in this calendar plan, the next logical thing is, okay, we've confronted our past, we've thought about it, we've now identified areas where we need to improve, so let's get down to business. So we say no. Because before you can get down to business, you actually need to discover who you really are. You have to form an identity, you have to form a belief of who you really are, and who you really are is a Jew with a soul, a strong soul, a pure soul, a beautiful soul, a burning soul. Where does that come out? When you blow the shofar. Where does it come out? When we say Avinu Malkeinu. Why Avinu Malkeinu? You ever thought about the expression Avinu Malkeinu? I'm sure we've talked about this before also. But Avinu Malkeinu is a contradiction in terms. Our Father, our King. Our Father, our King are two kings and fathers are very different. But that's the truth. We do have a relationship with God both. We have a relationship as a father and as a king. A father is a relationship where there's unconditional love, where we have a connection that cannot be broken, where we have an identity that cannot be erased. Malkeinu is different. He is our king. A king and subject is a relationship of functionality. You've got to keep the rules, you've got to keep he wants us to be a certain way. It's a behavior relationship, right, between a king and his subjects. So when we come to Rosh Hashanah, the first thing we do is say Avinu and then Malkeinu. And we use that phrase over and over. Avinu Malkeinu, Avinu Malkeinu, right? And really, in a way, I always think about it that Rosh Hashanah, the emphasis is the Avinu, and Yom Kippur, it's the Malkeinu. In other words, Rosh Hashanah, we come to say Avinu. You know what? That's our identity. Who we are your children. We have a soul. That soul deep down is connected to you. It's one with you. It's unbreakable. It's a bond that cannot be rubbed out, cannot be erased. That's who we are. If we really believe and we really tap into that shofar energy, and we really tap into that mitzvah of shofar, which obviously needs to be done by actually hearing the shofar, and we use the shofar power to create that identity, now we can approach the Yom Kippur plan. Now we can say, okay, I'm so connected to you, I want to rebuild my relationship with you, I want to improve my relationship with you. And here are the couple of specific things that I'm going to do it, and I'm going to do it operationally, and I'm going to do it successfully, and I'm going to do it responsibly, I'm going to do it step by step, I'm going to go on a journey. Okay, that's the practicalities of it, right? But before we can do that practicalities, we actually really need to believe in that identity. Just before I talk about the last part of the book, last part of the chapter, I should say, which is interesting, that also fits into this whole idea. Just want to talk about the shofar. I want to just plug it in. Make sure, please, this coming Rosh Hashanah, especially this year, I think this Rosh Hashanah, we really need to put in effort to hear the shofar both days. If you're not sure how you can do it, speak to me. If you're not sure where you can hear the shofar, maybe there's always people, if you can't make it to shul, the people who can blow the shofar for you. Let me know and try and do the mitzvah of shofar on both days, the first and the second day. Very, very powerful mitzvah. It's really one of the most powerful mitzvot. Okay. Then comes an interesting thing towards the end of the book, which is also very interesting. He says like this. He says, this brings us to an important question. If your beliefs and worldview play such an important role in your behavior, where do they come from in the first place? Okay, so the truth is, in the context I was talking about before, the identity is actually already there, but it does make an important point, nevertheless. It says, how exactly is your identity formed? I'm going to change that question. How exactly is your identity revealed, all right, or exposed? So he says, your identity emerges out of your habits, which is funny, right? Because you just said in order to form habits, you have to have an identity, right? You're not born with the preset beliefs, which is not true. With us, spiritually speaking, we are born with preset beliefs. The Talmud says, Yisrael ma'aminim b'nei ma'aminim. A Jew by nature, it's in the DNA of a Jew. We talked about this a few weeks ago about emunah. Every Jew in their nature is a believer, the child of a believer. We believe it's part of who we are. So we are connected. We're connected to God. Actually, we are born with that identity. Just we need to know how do we expose, how do we live, how do we feel that identity, right? So every belief, including those about yourself, is learned or conditioned through experience. So he says, more precisely, your habits are how you embody your identity. In other words, it doesn't say these words, but there's a concept that we've shared many, many times. And that is that although our values, our identity form our behavior, but behavior also affect our identity. That goes both ways, right? When we do something, right, as we said, acharei hamaasim nimshach halevavot, our heart follows our action. The power of action is tremendous. The more we do an action, the more we take a step forward in a particular habit, in a particular area of growth, the more our identity, I won't say is formed because it's there already, but our identity is strengthened, right? In other words, when we have that shofar, when we blow that shofar and we form our identity, the importance then of going on to develop good habits based on that relationship with God, whether it's in the area of our relationships, the way we treat other people, whether it's in our area of how we relate to God in various different forms, right? That importance then of developing that habit becomes so much more important, not only because it's important to have good habits, but it's also important because that will help preserve that identity. When we strengthen our emunah, our faith, particularly on Rosh Hashanah, Rosh Hashanah is a great time to reflect on faith. So that's when the connection between God and the Jewish and the soul comes into play, right? We want to strengthen that, we want to feel that, we want to continue to sustain that exposed identity on Rosh Hashanah that we built and that we felt and that we try to connect to and we tap into. Then the idea of forming good habits becomes even more important, because habits is what then enhances and sustains and brings to the consciousness that deep identity that we formed and that we have. Does that make sense? Yeah? And then he says an interesting thing. Because later on, when we form those habits, right, and those habits are then in line with our real belief system, they're in line with our identity, then every time we do the habit, we reflect on our identity. In other words, who's doing it, right? There was once a great, an elder Chassid in New York, and he, at a Farbrengen, he spoke about this. I'm pretty confident he didn't read the book, but he was a different world. But he said like this, he said that when it comes to Rosh Hashanah, he was talking to students in the yeshiva, and he said when it comes to Rosh Hashanah, he was encouraging them to take the inspiration of Rosh Hashanah and then translate it into tangible actions, tangible small actions. He says things you know you can manage, things you know will sustain. He says why? Not only because they're good things to do, and not only because they create another step in the journey of growth, but he said he was then talking about a particular context. It was in New York, and it was the time of the Lubavitcher Rebbe when the Lubavitcher Rebbe was alive, and Rosh Hashanah by the Lubavitcher Rebbe was something, actually not Rosh Hashanah, the whole Tishrei. You know, when I came to Sydney to live, I wasn't a rabbi yet, and I didn't have to, I was an ordained rabbi, but I wasn't a congregational rabbi, and if I didn't have commitments on Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, the time I would choose to go back to New York was always Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur and Sukkot, because the experience of spending those holidays with the Lubavitcher Rebbe was something out of this world. I mean, you had thousands and thousands of people. The Rebbe himself would blow the shofar on Rosh Hashanah. He would say all the verses before. There was often cry. It was just the most amazing. The Sukkot, the dancing, everything was just amazing. So he was talking to his brachim. He says, "You come here Rosh Hashanah. You're part of this energy. You're really uplifted. You're inspired, right? And then a month later, it's gone. So what are you going to do about that?" He said, "What you need to do is as follows. Putting in different words. You've created an identity. You've exposed who you really are. You've really rose to the occasion, right? Take upon yourself," he said, "one mitzvah, one thing you're going to strengthen. And every time you do it, you won't only be doing a good thing. Every time you do it, you're going to relive the Rosh Hashanah. You're going to relive that experience. Because every time you do it, that habit now will be a habit produced by your identity. It'll be a habit coming and guided by the time that you confirmed who you really are. And it will transport you back to that experience. And that's why the two things have to work together. To change habits, we need to form an identity. We need the Rosh Hashanah before the Yom Kippur, and before the behavior after the Yom Kippur. But when we do that, and that becomes the foundation of our habits, then we need to make sure, be committed to the continuous practice of those habits. And again, practicalities, we'll talk next week about how you do that, the four principles, he says, right? When you do that, but then every time you do that habit, every time you repeat that habit, you enforce that identity, you reconnect to that identity, you relive that identity. And just towards the end, he says the following. He says, putting this all together, you can see that habits are the path to changing your identity. The most practical way to change who you are is to change what you do. And then each time, so you start off the belief, and then every time you do it, it reinforces that identity, that belief, right? Each time you write a page, you're a writer. Each time you practice the violin, you're a musician. Each time you start a workout, you're an athlete. Each time you encourage your employees, you're a leader. Then he says, of course, it works the opposite way too. Every time you choose to perform a bad habit, it's a vote for that identity. The good news is that you don't need to be perfect. Now this line is an interesting line about it works the opposite way, because it actually doesn't in Judaism. Okay? Yeah, it works that way in practical habits, in life habits. But in our spiritual journey, in our emotional journey, in good versus bad, in the world of values, it actually doesn't work like that. Every time you do a good thing, it actually does enforce your identity. Every time you do a bad thing, it weakens the knowledge, the consciousness of your identity, but doesn't change your identity, because no person is a bad person. Right? So yes, every time you smoke a cigarette, you enforce your identity as being a smoker. But when it comes in terms of the values, how we treat other people, how we treat our spiritual journey, how we learn, how we study, the things that are value-based, morality-based, ethics-based, right? We actually have that positive identity. Each time we do a thing that's opposite to that, we send it more into the recesses of our soul maybe. We make it more hidden. We make it harder to discover. We make it harder to step into it. But we never change it. It's always there. And that's what Rosh Hashanah does. Rosh Hashanah reminds us that it's always there. The shofar is that we always have that identity. Hashem is always our Father. It's always Avinu. And then we commit to being Malkeinu, but it's always first Avinu. He's our Father. We are connected to Him. We have that burning soul. In the last number of months, we've seen that soul explode in so many different ways, in so many beautiful ways. We have to hold on to that. And this, as I said, this is a time, this year, we have to do it even more and even stronger and even deeper, because there's no greater time, I think, that we've had in our lifetime at least, that is so important to cement that identity, to strengthen that identity, to connect deeper to our Jewishness, and to really believe and to expose that belief of who are we. And when we confirm that who are we with the Rosh Hashanah experience, then we go on to the Yom Kippur experience, where we make a plan, each one in their own way, each one in their own journey, to change their habits and to be a better person in all different areas in the year ahead. So that's why I thought it was such a beautiful book, such a beautiful chapter, because it comes just at the right time to explain the time of year that we're in. Just before you go, just remember, those who want to take a flyer, just reminding you of all the things coming up, please do. And next week will be the last one of this series. But we'll talk about more practical strategies of how you change habits. But just a reminder again, this Monday night, for those who came in a bit later, Monday night at Shelley's house at 7:30. We're talking about some critical lessons of the month coming up, the new year. The second day will close those who are interested, and the Sukkot men's group and the Sukkot women's morning group. Have a wonderful week.
About habits and smoking, because last Rosh Hashanah, Rabbi Moss talked about a rabbi